Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. The world as we know it is shifting beneath our feet. We are witnessing a geopolitical earthquake, one that stretches from the streets of Gaza to the borders of Ukraine, from Moscow's strategic corridors to Washington's decision-making halls. The title of my talk today, Russia Advances, Israel Turns into a Battlefield, is not merely a statement of fact. It is a reflection of a deeper global transformation, an unraveling of old empires and the birth of a new, uncertain world order. Russia's strategic advance has become one of the defining features of the modern geopolitical landscape, not merely a military operation, but a calculated, multi-dimensional maneuver reshaping global power structures. What began as a regional conflict has evolved into a symbol of defiance against Western hegemony. In an era where the United States and its allies have long dictated the world's political and economic order, Russia's persistence on the global stage represents something more profound, a challenge to the entire architecture of post-Cold War dominance. The question that now looms over every capital, from Washington to Beijing, is simple yet unsettling. Has the West underestimated Russia's long game? From the very beginning, Western leaders framed Russia's actions as reckless aggression driven by imperial nostalgia. Yet beneath that narrative lies a more intricate reality, one driven by strategic patience and economic recalibration. Despite the barrage of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and media campaigns, Moscow has adapted, diversified, and reinforced its position. The Russian economy, far from collapsing, has pivoted eastward. Energy exports that once flowed toward Europe now fuel markets in Asia, particularly China and India, forming the backbone of a new economic bloc that openly resists Western financial dominance. The ruble, initially destabilized, has stabilized through strategic trade agreements that bypass the dollar entirely. Russia's geopolitical strategy goes beyond territory. It's about influence, economic, cultural, and informational. In regions once firmly under Western sway, from Africa to Latin America, Moscow has reemerged as a partner offering alternatives to the conditionality and austerity tied to Western aid. These alliances are not forged through ideology but through pragmatism, nations seeking sovereignty over dependency. This calculated diplomacy reflects a broader global fatigue with US-centric politics and its moral double standards. For many countries, Russia's defiance is less about admiration and more about inspiration, proof that the global order is no longer unshakable. Militarily, Russia's strategy has been equally adaptive. Rather than relying solely on brute force, Moscow has embraced asymmetric tactics, hybrid warfare blending cyber operations, information campaigns, and targeted military maneuvers. The battlefield, both literal and digital, has become a theater of psychological and political warfare. Western narratives of imminent Russian collapse have repeatedly met the reality of endurance, innovation, and a deep understanding of geopolitical timing. Each advance, whether territorial or diplomatic, is a reminder that power today is not measured only in tanks or missiles, but in the ability to outlast, outmaneuver, and redefine the rules of engagement. Yet perhaps the most striking aspect of Russia's advance is how it exposes the fractures within the West itself. European unity, once seen as ironclad, now strains under the weight of rising energy prices, economic instability, and political discontent. The same sanctions intended to weaken Russia have fueled inflation, protests, and growing skepticism among European citizens about their leaders' allegiance to U.S. policy. In this sense, Russia's advance is not only external, it has reached deep into the domestic politics of its rivals, shaking the very foundations of transatlantic solidarity. The world now stands at a crossroads. As Russia continues to assert its position, the old assumptions of Western superiority are fading. What was once considered the periphery is now becoming the center of strategic gravity. Every move Moscow makes reverberates across continents, forcing nations to reassess alliances, redefine their interests, and confront the uncomfortable truth that power, like history, never remains in one place for too long. Russia's advance is not just a campaign. It is a statement to the world that the balance of power has begun to shift, and no amount of rhetoric can turn back the tide. The fall of Western economic control is no longer a distant theory discussed in academic circles. It is unfolding before our very eyes. The dominance once enjoyed by the United States and its European allies is slowly eroding, not through war or invasion, but through economic evolution and the shifting gravity of global trade. For decades, the Western world built its supremacy on the strength of the dollar, the reach of its financial institutions, and the illusion that globalization worked best under its leadership. Yet as we move deeper into the 21st century, that illusion is breaking apart, replaced by a growing realization that the global economy is no longer the West's exclusive playground. The balance of economic power is tilting, and those who once dictated the rules are now struggling to keep up with the game they created. At the heart of this transformation lies the weaponization of finance, a strategy that once gave the West unrivaled leverage, but is now turning against it. When Western powers impose sweeping sanctions on nations like Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, they expected economic collapse and submission. Instead, they triggered a counter-reaction, a worldwide effort to build systems that bypass Western banks, currencies, and trade networks. The rise of alternative payment systems, currency swaps, and digital financial mechanisms has accelerated a quiet revolution in global trade. Countries once dependent on the dollar are now engaging in direct currency exchanges, reducing reliance on U.S.-controlled institutions like SWIFT and the IMF. What began as an attempt to punish has become the catalyst for independence. This unraveling of economic control is perhaps most visible in the shifting alliances of the global South. Nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, long pressured by Western lenders and political conditions, are now finding new partners in China, Russia, and regional blocs like BRICS. The appeal is simple yet powerful: cooperation without coercion. The BRICS nations' growing influence, especially their move toward developing a shared currency, represents a direct challenge to the dollar's dominance. Once dismissed as symbolic, these initiatives now carry weight as more nations express interest in joining and diversifying their financial futures. The world is quietly building an economy where Washington's approval is no longer the ticket to participation. Meanwhile, within the Western world itself, cracks are deepening. Inflation, rising inequality, and stagnant growth have exposed the weaknesses of neoliberal capitalism, the very model that once propelled Western economies to power. The system that promised prosperity through free markets has instead delivered instability and discontent. Ordinary citizens from London to Los Angeles are questioning why decades of global leadership have not translated into security or fairness at home. As wealth concentrates in the hands of a few and corporations continue to profit amid crisis, the moral authority of the West's economic system is fading. The rest of the world is watching and learning that there are alternatives. The most striking irony is that the very tools that once secured Western control, sanctions, trade agreements, and global institutions, are now hastening its decline. By overusing financial dominance as a weapon, the West has taught others how to live without it. The shift is not dramatic or loud. It is slow, methodical, and irreversible. Factories, investments, and innovation are moving eastward. Energy markets are being redefined. Digital currencies are eroding the monopoly of Western banks. The pillars of the old economic order are trembling, and the world's emerging powers are ready to take their place in the spotlight. The fall of Western economic control is not the collapse of capitalism itself. It is the end of its monopoly. The world is not rejecting progress or prosperity. It is rejecting dependency. The West's era of unchallenged financial dominance is fading into history, replaced by a new reality, one where power is shared, competition is global, and no single empire controls the pulse of the world's economy. The change is already here, and those who fail to adapt will soon find themselves spectators in a world they once ruled. Israel's internal and external crisis has become one of the most defining and destabilizing elements in today's geopolitical landscape, a convergence of political fragmentation, societal unrest, and military escalation that threatens not only Israel's own future, but the fragile balance of the entire Middle East. What was once hailed as the region's most stable democracy is now confronting a reckoning of its own making. The illusion of security, long sustained by military dominance and Western backing, is crumbling under the weight of deep divisions at home and rising hostility abroad. The world is witnessing a nation that once prided itself on unity and strength, now struggling to hold itself together as it fights battles on multiple fronts, political, social, and existential. Inside Israel, the internal fractures are no longer subtle. They are tearing through the fabric of society. The political system is paralyzed by endless power struggles, ideological polarization, and a growing disconnect between the government and its citizens. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's controversial judicial reforms sparked massive protests that brought hundreds of thousands into the streets, not just as a rejection of a policy, but as a cry against authoritarian drift. The Israeli public is split between those demanding democracy and accountability and those rallying behind a vision of security that justifies any means necessary. This tension has left the country in a constant state of political volatility where governance has given way to survival and national unity feels like a fading memory. Beyond the borders, Israel's external crisis is rapidly escalating. The renewed and devastating conflict with Hamas in Gaza has transformed the region into a war zone that extends far beyond its immediate boundaries. The military operations, airstrikes, and humanitarian catastrophe unfolding daily have drawn widespread condemnation and inflamed anti-Israeli sentiment across the world. Regional actors, from Iran to Hezbollah, are capitalizing on this instability, positioning themselves as defenders of Palestinian resistance and challengers to Israeli power. The Middle East, once cautiously moving toward normalization with Israel through the Abraham Accords, is now retreating into mistrust and confrontation. The dream of regional cooperation is slipping away, replaced by the familiar nightmare of endless conflict. What makes this crisis even more profound is the erosion of Israel's moral legitimacy on the global stage. Once viewed by many in the West as a symbol of democracy in a turbulent region, Israel now faces accusations of human rights violations and disproportionate use of force. Images of civilian casualties, demolished neighborhoods, and humanitarian blockades dominate international media, fueling outrage and protests across Europe, Asia, and even the United States, Israel's closest ally. The narrative has shifted. The nation once seen as a victim of aggression is increasingly portrayed as an aggressor in the eyes of global opinion. This shift carries real consequences, not only diplomatically but economically, as international isolation and internal discontent deepen. Compounding this turmoil is the growing sense of insecurity among Israelis themselves. The promise of safety that the state was built upon feels uncertain amid rocket sirens, escalating regional threats, and social division. The younger generation, disillusioned by corruption and endless war, questions the path their leaders have chosen. Meanwhile, the country's economy, long sustained by innovation and foreign investment, faces strain as instability undermines investor confidence and diverts resources to military operations. Israel's crisis today is not the result of a single event, but the culmination of years of unresolved contradictions. A nation built on the pursuit of security now finds itself consumed by fear. A democracy founded on unity now fractured by division. Its external wars mirror its internal ones, both driven by an unwillingness to confront the deep moral and political questions at the heart of its identity. What happens next in Israel will not only shape its own destiny, but could determine the course of an entire region standing on the edge of transformation or collapse. The Middle East has once again emerged as the world's most volatile flashpoint, a region where local conflicts ripple outward, reshaping global politics, energy markets, and ideological divides. For decades, the world has tried to contain the region's instability, but today it stands at the center of an unfolding geopolitical storm that no power can fully control. The convergence of war, economic pressure, and shifting alliances has turned the Middle East into the arena where the world's great powers test their influence, and where every decision, from a ceasefire to an oil embargo, can send shockwaves across continents. The question facing global leaders now is not whether the Middle East will erupt, but how long they can afford to watch as it transforms from a regional crisis into a global reckoning. The Israel-Palestine conflict, once thought to be a frozen stalemate, has reignited with ferocity, drawing in both regional and international players. The escalating violence in Gaza and the West Bank has shattered illusions of peace and exposed the deep hypocrisy of global diplomacy. Nations that once called for stability now find themselves entangled in a moral and political dilemma: how to defend human rights while maintaining strategic alliances. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding before the world's eyes has fueled anger across the global South and even within Western societies, where public opinion increasingly diverges from official policy. The conflict has reignited anti-Western sentiment, providing fertile ground for movements that challenge the old order of global politics. Yet the current crisis extends beyond the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Across the region, power struggles are intensifying. Iran continues to assert itself as a regional powerhouse, expanding its influence through strategic alliances with groups in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Its confrontation with Israel and the United States is not just military, but ideological, a clash over who defines the future of the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, once firmly aligned with Washington, now plays a more independent role, balancing between East and West, forging new ties with China and cautiously re-engaging with Iran. The Gulf states, long considered the economic engine of the region, are quietly reshaping their foreign policies to adapt to a world where U.S. protection is no longer guaranteed. This new Middle East is defined by uncertainty, but also by transformation. The balance of power that once favored Western influence is slipping as regional players assert sovereignty and global actors like China and Russia expand their footprints. Beijing's mediation between Riyadh and Tehran, for example, symbolized a historic shift, proof that diplomacy in the Middle East no longer revolves solely around Washington or Brussels. Moscow, too, has capitalized on Western distraction, strengthening ties with Arab nations and positioning itself as an alternative broker in regional conflicts. The result is a crowded and unpredictable geopolitical landscape where alliances are fluid and loyalty is measured in strategy, not ideology. Economically, the stakes are immense. The Middle East remains the heartbeat of global energy, and any disruption, from conflict to sanctions, sends tremors through the world's oil markets. But as energy transitions reshape the global economy, the region's rulers are also racing to diversify, investing in technology, infrastructure, and tourism to secure their relevance in a post-oil world. Yet these ambitions remain vulnerable to the ever-present threat of instability. A single missile strike or political miscalculation can undo years of progress, reminding the world that peace in the Middle East is both fragile and fleeting. What makes the region such a powerful flashpoint is that it embodies the contradictions of our time: wealth and poverty, faith and politics, modernity and tradition. It is the place where global ambitions collide with local realities. Every act of aggression, every diplomatic gesture carries global consequences. As the great powers maneuver and local forces fight for survival, the Middle East once again stands as the world's mirror, reflecting humanity's failure to learn from its past and its unending struggle to find balance in a world driven by power, pride, and fear. The decline of U.S. global authority is no longer a topic whispered among analysts. It is a visible, undeniable reality shaping the international order. For decades, the United States stood as the uncontested leader of the world, its military, economy, and ideology setting the standard for global power. But today, that dominance is eroding, not in one sudden collapse, but through a gradual loss of trust, credibility, and influence. The symbols of American power, from the dollar to its diplomatic leverage, are being tested in ways unseen since the end of World War II. The world is changing, and for the first time in generations, Washington is no longer the unquestioned center of it. The roots of this decline lie in a series of miscalculations and contradictions that have slowly corroded America's moral and strategic foundation. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, once justified as crusades for freedom and democracy, ended in disillusionment and chaos. These conflicts exposed the limits of U.S. military power and its inability to impose political stability through force. Trillions of dollars were spent, countless lives lost, yet the result was a weakening of global confidence in America's vision of leadership. The images of desperate evacuations from Kabul, reminiscent of Saigon decades earlier, became powerful symbols of decline, a superpower unable to control the consequences of its own actions. Meanwhile, at home, the internal fractures of American society have spilled onto the world stage. Political polarization, racial tensions, and economic inequality have eroded the image of a united and stable democracy. The same nation that once lectured others about governance now struggles to govern itself. The attack on the U.S. Capitol in 2021, broadcast to the entire world, was not just a domestic crisis. It was a global statement that American democracy is no longer the unshakable model it once claimed to be. For allies, it raised doubts about America's reliability. For rivals, it revealed vulnerability. Economically, the challenge to U.S. dominance has become even more pronounced. The rise of China as a global manufacturing and financial powerhouse has shifted the balance of trade and technology. Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative now connects continents, while Washington grapples with debt ceilings and partisan gridlock. The dollar, once the undisputed pillar of the global economy, faces competition as nations diversify their reserves and trade in alternative currencies. Sanctions, once the United States' most potent weapon, are losing effectiveness as targeted nations learn to build parallel systems. The world is no longer willing to accept American rules without question. It is learning to play by its own. On the diplomatic front, the United States finds itself surrounded by skepticism. Traditional allies in Europe are increasingly acting independently, wary of Washington's shifting priorities. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the one-sided support for Israel amid humanitarian crises, and the inconsistent handling of global issues like climate change have all damaged America's credibility. The idea of the U.S. as a moral leader, the defender of freedom and justice, rings hollow when its actions often contradict its ideals. The more Washington preaches democracy abroad while struggling to maintain it at home, the more the gap between image and reality widens. What makes this moment historic is not just that U.S. influence is fading, it's that a new order is emerging to fill the vacuum. Nations like China, Russia, India, and even regional powers such as Turkey and Brazil are asserting their voices on the global stage. The world is no longer unipolar. It is fragmented, multipolar, and unpredictable. Power is diffusing, and Washington can no longer dictate terms. It must negotiate them. The decline of U.S. global authority is not merely the story of one nation's fall, it is the story of a world learning to live without a single master. The age of unquestioned American supremacy has ended, and a new, uncertain era has begun, one in which the United States must adapt or risk becoming a relic of the empire it once was. The world today stands at a turning point, a profound and irreversible transition in global order that is reshaping the political, economic, and ideological foundations of international power. The systems and structures built in the aftermath of World War II, once designed to secure stability and American-led prosperity, are beginning to fracture under the pressure of a new reality. Nations are no longer content to exist as spectators in a world dominated by a few. They are asserting their voices, reclaiming agency, and rewriting the rules that govern the last century. What we are witnessing is not simply a shift in leadership, it is a transformation of how power itself operates in the modern age. For much of the 20th century, the world revolved around a single gravitational center, the United States and its Western allies. Through institutions like the United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank, they set the terms of engagement for global politics and economics. Democracy, free markets, and Western values were presented as universal truths, the blueprint for civilization itself. But as the decades passed, cracks began to appear in that carefully constructed narrative. The promises of globalization, equality, prosperity, and progress were not evenly distributed. While the West prospered, much of the world was left struggling under debt, inequality, and dependency. Those unfulfilled promises have now become the fault lines of a new global awakening. Emerging powers, from China to India, from Brazil to South Africa, are no longer content to play supporting roles in a script written by others. The rise of the BRICS alliance symbolizes more than economic cooperation. It represents a collective rejection of Western dominance and an embrace of multipolarity. Trade, energy, and diplomacy are being restructured around new centers of gravity. The dollar's once unchallenged supremacy faces competition as nations explore alternative currencies and payment systems. Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative connects continents in ways that bypass traditional Western routes of influence, while Moscow, despite sanctions, continues to leverage its vast resources and military clout to assert itself in Eurasia and beyond. The New World Order is not a vision of harmony. It is a complex, competitive, and constantly shifting landscape where every power must adapt or risk obsolescence. Technology, too, has become both a weapon and a frontier in this transition. The digital age has democratized power in ways no empire could have anticipated. Social media, artificial intelligence, and cyber capabilities have turned information into the new currency of control. Nations no longer rise solely through territory or armies, but through data, innovation, and influence. The ability to shape global narratives, to define truth itself, is now as important as military strength. In this arena, traditional powers find themselves challenged not only by rival states, but by decentralized networks, corporations, and even individuals capable of shaping global perception in real time. This transition is not without chaos. Old alliances are faltering, new blocs are forming, and uncertainty has become the defining feature of international politics. The once stable frameworks of global governance, NATO, the EU, the WTO, are being tested by both internal divisions and external challenges. Nations are turning inward, prioritizing self-sufficiency and sovereignty over cooperation. Protectionism, nationalism, and ideological extremism are rising as societies grapple with the fear of losing control in a rapidly transforming world. Yet amid the uncertainty lies opportunity, the chance to redefine what global leadership means. The transition underway is not simply the decline of one order, but the birth of another, one that reflects the diversity and complexity of the modern world. It is a time of realignment and redefinition, where power is no longer a matter of possession, but of adaptability. The New World Order will not be dictated by one flag or ideology. It will be shaped by those who understand that in a time of change, survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the most flexible.